I'm admitting some new people in the session here. Welcome to those who just joined. So I'm speaking about Sylvain Carle, a self-proclaimed nerd, socialist, and pragmatist. Sylvain believes in technology as a means to transform complex systems, even if he knows it's quite hard, and loves investing in ideas and people aiming to change sectors and industries. He's a senior director at Second News Capital in Montreal, where he focuses on entrepreneurial climate innovation. He served as general partner and at Real Ventures from 2014 to 2020. And he's also worked in the early years at Twitter. We also have with us Horace Clemmons. He's in North Carolina right now, I believe. Welcome, Sylvain, with us. Sylvain just joined. Horace Clemmons, what can I say about Horace? Horace was born in Alabama. He served in the Army in Vietnam. He worked in computer science, computer technology for a large part of his life for IBM. He was the first person to have the idea of using the personal computer as a means of payment, as a point of sale. Started his own company, sold that idea to IBM. He's been working in innovation, in open innovation and open manufacturing for all his life. The reason that I chose these three people for the panel to have this discussion goes back to the connection I have with Horace, which goes back to solidarity work I did in Cuba. And when I discovered Horace, it was around a project, the Ogun Tractor, which I'll have the opportunity of talking about a little later. And I want to set the ground for this conversation and the link to the Fab Labs and the Fab City movement. When I heard about the Ogun open source tractor and I had my first conversation with Horace, I soon realized that the conversation was much more than about tractors. And I quickly realized that, and he said it that way, that he doesn't make or sell tractors. For him, it's a way of thinking. And arriving in the world of Fab Lab for me, which was quite late in my career, I immediately saw, in fact, in the Fab Lab culture, we work collaboratively in open innovation. So it's very much an open culture of sharing ideas and working with each other's ideas, sharing iterations, prototyping, and trying to advance together. And discussing with Horace, I realized very quickly that this is not a new thing, and that a lot of people from different fields have been working in this way for a long time, and Horace is one of them. And I thought his story, many stories were quite interesting and could serve as a good basis for us to have a conversation on how this changes the way we look at our economy. And as you know, the Fab City concept in itself of challenging cities to produce the majority of what they consume and work collaboratively using the digital tools at our disposal to help advance society while also trying to advance ecologically and socially. It came to me that this would be an interesting conversation to see how these ideas have been around for a long time and how maybe now this is a coming of age. And we can work together to create these new business models. So without further ado, I'd like to give the microphone to Horace and have him talk to us about his road as an entrepreneur and his story. Horace, the microphone is yours.
All right, so the first thing, I hope everyone can hear me very well. And then I would like to share my screen.
Please go ahead, Horace.
So I think it's really important to look at the things in my life that shaped the way I think about things. So I'm 78 years old, and I really believe I've had a very good life. I've walked behind mules and I pulled an 8-foot cotton sack down the row. I served in combat in the U.S. Marines in Vietnam. I got into computers in 1962 when they were called electronic accounting machines. So I grew up in that evolution to where we are in computing today. I left IBM in 1983 to start my own business. And we'll go into that more, but I built that business office in 7 countries. And we were the first business to use the PC in a transaction processing environment. I really left IBM because they saw the PC as something you played games on in the living room, and I believed that it was the future of all computing. So Dell started in 1984. So I left IBM and started using the PC in a business environment before Dell made their first computer. So how did I get involved in the movement to change the way our economy works? Well, some of you may be aware, and it was referenced by Martin, the efforts to build a tractor for Cuba. And in that endeavor, I understood that Cuba wasn't alone. The problem in Cuba was not unique. It's a global problem. And that problem is the global economic divide. So that really started me on that journey to try to figure out ways to reduce the global economic divide. When we were in Cuba, a young man said to me, and I told him it was a great phrase and I would use it and give him credit for it. He said, "It's not a tractor, it's a way of thinking." And so I looked and said, if we're going to understand how to create a path for financial success to those at the bottom, we really need to understand how do the global corporations do it. But also in that analysis looked and said, okay, so starting where I started, how did I become financially secure? And I said, those are the things that we need to focus on. And it's really just 2 key elements. It's access to finance and access to technology. So my business partner was born in Cuba. His father-in-law loaned us $200,000, and IBM had given me all the technology training that I needed, and therefore success was easy. We paid the $200,000 back the first year and built a significant size business. So I said, okay, so what are the key things that, the global corporations use to get their dominance? So, well, they spend their money on market research, product design, and supply chain systems. And I said, well, we've got to find a way to do that for the local economy. The thing I learned in the Marine Corps is there are no rules. And if you follow the rules, you're probably dead and the other guy wins. And so every time there's an opportunity to change the rules, you create a whole new set of winners. So the PC wasn't really something that IBM knew what it would turn into. So I knew Don Estridge, the guy that built the PC. And when I went to his office in Boca Raton, he had a sign hanging on the wall to his team that says, "We will build a computer using all off-the-shelf, easily obtainable parts, and we'll publish the design." And I asked Don, how did you do that? How did you get IBM executives to agree that? And he said, well, they didn't see that. What I said to them was, this is how many businesses there are. So there's how many computers you can sell. This is how many people there are. If you let me build a computer the way I want to build it, then we'll sell a lot of them. If you don't, Apple, Tandy, Acorn, Commodore, they'll get all the business. A lot of people have never heard of Don Estridge, but I say that Don Estridge is the guy that created most of the billionaires that we know today. So by publishing that design, that became the computer on the chip. So the things that Don did created the architecture that, as I said, created all the billionaires that we know today. So as I started to look at how do I change things and help impact people, I said, well, it's not a tractor, it's a way of thinking. And all I did was copy what Don Estridge had done in the computer industry and applied it to manufacturing. So I said, I'll start with an architecture that says I have a power source, and beyond that power source, I create an architecture such that I can build anything I want to and go forward that way. So when I built the tractor, I had plans to build a 2-wheel tractor and a 4-wheel tractor and other things. So I'll have a 2-wheel tractor available the first quarter next year. So if you look at this, we have sold tractors in 22 countries, 38 states, United States, with only 2 people in the company. So not only did I realize I had to create an architecture so that I could distribute the jobs and so that I could build tractors easily, I also realized that we had to be able to do something with the business model side of it. And so we'll come into some of that later. So in my mind, I envisioned a version of capitalism that leaves the money where the value is added and created a business model that provides access to finance. So in doing this, I said, I cannot loan everybody money, but I can create a business model that minimizes the amount of money that is needed. So that's what I did with the tractor. 1 employee, and I've shipped tractors all over the world. I have a very little overhead, the back end of an old dilapidated warehouse, and very few tools. Everything else is farmed out within the community. So the community benefits from the business that we do. The other piece that we have to change is, I've talked to deans of universities and I ask them, do they realize that they are contributing to the economic divide? And most of them find that shocking. And I say, well, your primary goal is to teach young people how to go get jobs with global corporations so they can get a good salary and make a good living. And your focus really needs to be on the economy that's within a 200-mile radius of your campus and ensuring that you help local people build an economy. So that is a brief introduction into who I am and what I try to do.
Thank you, Horace. That was fantastic. I'm tempted to go to Béatrice because in your last slide, a lot of the principles you talked about that built your businesses and your projects around it are very common to what we find in the cooperative sector, the social economy. And I'm curious to see what you have to say about that, Béatrice.
Yeah, I realized when I was preparing, I realize now that a lot of my notes that I'd made to prepare were reacting to this experience and not presenting the social economy so much. So maybe I'll just do a brief parenthesis before to talk about the social economy. The social economy is a major component of the economy of Quebec and has been for over 100 years. And the way we defined it, they're collective enterprises, so cooperatives or enterprising nonprofits. So by definition, enterprises, meaning that they sell a good or product, a service or a product, but that are accountable, owned by and accountable to the community. And when Horace was talking about local impact, 76% of social economy enterprises in Quebec serve a local or regional market. So they're really by and for the community first. And the notion of collective and democratic governance means that everyone has a voice, that there's a mechanism to ensure accountability, which is important both in times of shock, good or bad, to adjust the service, the pricing, the redistribution of profits in order to maintain quality, accessibility, and long-term stability, existence of these enterprises. So we find they're more resilient and longer lasting than privately owned enterprises. This being said, and I think sometimes we talk about the social economy as being a different business model applied to whatever sector that they operate, because they operate in many different sectors. So how do we provide a service or provide a good, but change the business model behind that, the thinking behind how we're going to deliver that? And I think Horace's presentation is a really good example of another way of going around that with an explicit objective of transformation, of social impact. So when I was thinking about it, as it's innovative in that that's not the model that's predominant today. That's not what most people think about when they think about how are we going to do this? How are we going to do it efficiently? How are we going to make it last? A lot of people think of a very classic capitalist ownership structure. But I think the notion of working together, of that sharing ideas and resources has a bigger impact isn't new. And there's something interesting about how that's being reorganized and how different tools of communication and digital tools allow us to rethink how we go about doing that. I think the idea of not basing things on private ownerships of the means of production, that means of production are open to many, and therefore profits, whether that's technologically advances or financing, are open to many, are more dispersed, is a really interesting answer to rising global inequality. So more accessible ideas, work, production, profits in more places, because we see these problems in our countries, but at a global scale, it's staggering. And also environmental degradation. So having more localized production is a really interesting starting point. So in theory, the part that I think I'm still puzzling around is that in theory, shared information and distributed production allows for better adaptation for workers and for consumers. The piece that I'm missing is about community. And so how do we ensure, for example, I was thinking about like an Airbnb model, if it was owned by the home renters, if the owners of houses in a community were already unequally distributed, a system like that accrues more resources will exacerbate those inequalities. So how do we also have a check-in on the more global impact? Because I think for workers, they will go where they're interested in, and producers will also. But how do we look at the broader impact of these systems? And by this, I don't want to say that these models are bad. I want to say that they're confusing and that they're new. I don't think we entirely know what the full potential is. Who has the capacity to do what? Can anyone benefit from these systems? What are the prerequisites for accessing, for working in this, for producing in this, for consuming in this, for managing this? Who's accountable? And ultimately, from a systemic point of view, if things go wrong or if things go strong, if things are going really well, as a worker, as a producer, as a consumer, as a community member, as a government, who can we hold accountable? Who can we contact? Who can we limit or encourage in order for these models to really take on the full potential and systemic transformation that we want to see? So in the social economy, I would say that the ownership piece is the key piece for us, that because it's collective and democratic, that accountability mechanism will ensure that the process and the results meet the needs of the community. But I don't think it's the only model, as we've seen. And so I think we need to be thinking about this notion of accountability. And are these, when it's disruptive and a little bit scary, I think, with like all the, the cryptocurrencies and all of these new distributed ways to produce, share resources, share ideas, is it unmanaged? Are they unmanageable? Like no one can control them, which is one pros and cons, or are they just unknown? Like we're not really sure the full impact, the potential, the risks, and how do we harness, my interest is how do we harness the strengths of these models to adjust to potential pitfalls and ensure that they don't exacerbate certain inequalities or degradation. One of the significant barriers, I would say, in the social economy, but I think for many, is the question of access. So how do we work around systemic exclusions of racialized people, of less educated people, of more rural or remote or otherwise marginalized communities to ensure that they can harness information, tools, business opportunities that these open processes offer. For example, one of the examples, Fab Labs are all over the place, but often they're within universities. They're not well known and certainly underused by members of the community. There were practices in Mexico that were really interesting about inciting people from the community to come in to get to know these, including people who were illiterate or had no technological knowledge, that I think are really interesting that we could learn from. And there's certainly no funding to do that in Quebec, actually.
Tapping the unused brain potential that Neil Gershenfeld was talking about this morning, and offering a path in Fab Labs for people that maybe don't fit that well in a formal university setting, but will thrive in a community setting where they have access to tools.
Because it's not enough to just say the room is there, the tools are there, the information is there, and it's open for everyone. People don't always know that they're there or are intimidated to go in and take full avail of them.
And that's why we're holding these events and having these conversations. I want to go back to you later, Béatrice, on something else.
Can I do one last point?
Yes, please,
Sorry.
go ahead.
My other point is about replicability and ultimately scale. I think that the size of the challenges that we're faced are huge. And so sometimes we see really interesting but niche projects or processes that work really well, but at a small scale. And sometimes I worry about models, and I haven't had this conversation with Horace, but like, how much are we hoping for individuals with good values to do innovative things? And how much are we setting up a system that will incite everyone, including those with less exemplary values, to do the right thing? So what are the incentives to multiply these cases or to extend these cases? What levers, either from private actors or governmental actors, can be put into place for Fab Labs and other spaces that enable collaborative production? And I think, yeah, we need to, particularly given the need to produce more efficient practices, whether that's enable repairing, just that, or new processes that are more efficient from the environmental point of view, is urgent. We've all, read the results of the last report that just came out. And then my last point was just on government, because Horace was saying, how do we bring individuals to have financial autonomy? I think sometimes we look to the market and we don't think enough about government. If we want to scale revolutionary ideas, we need to be engaging with government. Public money goes into our government. We have a right to ensure that what goes out is for public good. Certainly governments support private enterprises. They also put in rules that encourage or discourage certain kinds of behavior. We need to be asking of them that they are supporting these processes that are transformative. So yeah, by either supporting businesses in key moments or regulating the impact of certain businesses for the well-being of the community. And one of my questions, I guess, that I would have for this panel is, how do you convince governments when it's something that's so diffused in terms of governance, impact, production, to support and recognize these processes?
Thank you so much, Béatrice. In one of your last points, you talked about the conditions, facilitating this. And one of the things we need for this to thrive is financing. And so I want to go to Sylvain. Normally, when we're financing innovation, there's the notion of giving a value to those ideas and calculating the value, the future value of those ideas once they're going to be taken to market. So we tend to protect those ideas, right, and not share them openly. This morning in one of our sessions, Thomas Diaz was reminding us that we really need to move quickly to face the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and all that entails. And so to move faster, open innovation seems like a good route, right, to work together and share on open systems that speak and work with each other. We know that that's how the military works, because they also need to move fast in innovation, right, when you're trying to counteract innovations on the enemy side. And so that's how they practice innovation in R&D. The financing there is not a problem because it's coming from the state, right? So there's a budget, you innovate, we supply the military, and so that's sort of a guaranteed market. But in the free market and in the social economy market, which is operating in a free market economy, there's venture capital, there's risk capital, but normally that capital tends to look at short windows and needs a guarantee, needs something to guarantee the reimbursement. And you tackle things like climate change with venture capital. So with what's been said so far and what I just said, how do we approach this, and what's changing, what needs to change in the world of finance?
Yeah, and I mean, the world of finance is conservative. I would have never thought of using the army as an example of efficient government investments.
It's not efficient, but it's what I mean is working as open innovation.
A lot of the innovation that we take for granted now, like the internet and GPS and other things, was funded by military research. But I don't want to delve too much into that today. I'm not an expert into that, so I don't want to fumble with the subject. I think my perspective on finance and money for people and for the planet really starts from a hacker mindset, right? I have a background as a programmer, as someone who's worked in IT, in technology. And for me, the same way that when you're trying to debug a program, you look at the data and you say, okay, in that part of the program is the data right, and that part of the program is the data right, and you put some breakpoints and you try to look at if you poke holes to the system to see what works, what doesn't work. That's been my approach with finance, and to say, how does it work? If I follow the flow of money, where does it come from? Where does it go? When does it increase? Where is it valued less? And then layer this second perspective of it's not all about money. So if we have a system in which we value what is not only money, but we value what is we call extra financial data. So people benefit, like, are people better or worse after this system has been put in place? The planet, if you scrap the planet and there's no more people, there's no more economy. So might have been a great idea for like a few hundred years, but it's worth nothing. So maybe we want to stop you from doing that thing that will lead to nothing. And so really looking at what's the accounting of good open innovation and of social systems. And you really have to go check the flow of money and look at where it comes from, where it goes, and who benefits from it. I really like that idea of saying, when Horace said the value should stay where it's created and where there's production, where it's, Tim O'Reilly calls this create more value than you capture, right? So let the system benefit from people in it, participating positively in the system. To do that, we also have to identify people who are participating negatively, right? So who are taking too much from the system, draining the system. And those are the questions that we started asking ourselves a few years ago. And so in finance, the acronym that is all the rage right now is ESG. What's ESG is environmental, social, and governance. You can't be a company and not take care of these three important letters that represent life. And why is that? It's because we're moving from shareholder capitalism, where you maximize the return of money to people who are shareholders in the company, to stakeholder finance, right? Stakeholder is everyone who's impacted by what you're doing should have a say in the way things are happening and in the redistribution of wealth that's created in the process. We were not that far along those lines, right? So and if I go back to my open source programmer background, the initial open source value creation was that you could use a system for free, you could improve it, but the social contract was that if you improve it for yourself, you have to give it back to others. So that was baked in. So if you think about free software, and I know the exact words are important too. If you look at the free software movement, the core principle was not technical, it was social. It was a social contract. If you improve this technically, you have the moral and legal rights to redistribute your improvements. So you can't capture all the value just for yourself. You have to redistribute the value that you've created for yourself for others. And this, in an infinite world, is a virtuous system. As long as there's value accrues and everyone benefits from it. And then I think Béatrice, you rightly pointed to the problem of scale. A lot of the challenges with these systems come when you try to scale them, and then you incur costs, upfront costs, for you to be able to scale. And that's often where there's some friction. The last point I want to make for this intro is to say the governance of these systems has often been bottom up, but there's a term I like a lot in these software communities. They call it the benevolent dictator. So it's this idea of you can't have chaos and produce an organized system. You have to be organized. So I think the way that Horace, you set the company and the access to the plans, and so there's some form of structure and organization that needs to be put in place from the get-go for these systems to scale. And this is often, as I've seen, the key piece. Like we have great ideas, there's some innovation, but we haven't thought about what's the structure, the infrastructure, the social structure that needs to grow sometimes faster than the project or the product for it to scale. And that's for me, that's the conundrum. That's one bug that I haven't found yet the fix for, but it's so that it was super interesting for me to have this conversation, to try to explore like different ways that people have tried to tackle this sort of like scaling problem, right? So I'll pause at that, but it seems to me like one of the major challenges that we've been seeing in some of those more innovative social movements, or even social companies, or you call them not-for-profit entrepreneurial. I don't know. I don't remember, Béatrice, what you said, how you call them, but the where you maximize the benefits for everyone and not just for shareholders.
Social economy enterprises or collective enterprises.
Collective enterprises, I quite like that.
Right.
Horace, what does this generate in terms of reactions on your side?
Well, so early on in my career with IBM, and I was fortunate, I was a super techie, and they sent me all over the world to interact with retailers all over the world. So I was hard to believe, but I was the key technical guru on IBM's product. And so I learned some things early on that says, look, the consumer is the one that dictates your success or your failure. And I used to tell retailers all the time that I'd ask them, what are the 3 key ingredients that a consumer considers when they get ready to do a purchase? Now, these were questions I was asking before Walmart came around. And retailers would say, well, it's price, price, and price. And I would laugh and say, no, that's not it. Now, Walmart built their whole business on that concept. They built their entire business on price. So at that time, they were right. Consumer was, largely price. But I would say to them, let me tell you what it's going to be. It's going to be time, convenience, and location. And location is going to be the couch. So anything we do, if we don't think of the consumer, now Bezos proved I was right. How long's Amazon been in business? 20 years.
20 years.
Okay, so Bezos proved I was right. So when we start thinking about how we change economies and how we create opportunity for those at the bottom, we've got to say, well, how do we allow them to compete against Bezos? And so that's the point I mentioned. I said, look, if those at the bottom don't have what Bezos has, market research, product design, and supply chain management, they will never satisfy the consumer's need of time, convenience, and get it at my couch.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So if we want to change things, we can't dictate how they change. We can look back and say, what is the infrastructure that we must create to allow change?
Yeah, I would add to that, understanding what's changing. And I'd like to bring that back to climate, right? If you understand what's changing or what needs to change, and in the market dynamic, you go against those that would prefer things not to change, call them conservative or head in the sand. Because that's what happened with business, right? Sears was on TV, like the president of Sears was on TV and said, you're not going to displace a company like ours with a computer screen. He was wrong. That's easy to say today. What can we start to understand and discern that will make the assumptions of today wrong? And I think one of those is that we have a finite amount of resources and we can't be making more and more and more and more things and have an environment that will support humans. Like we can't. We can't. It's like a physical. It's physically proven. It's don't mess with physics. These laws are pretty well known. So this has to change. I think one challenge we have is that as we talk about new innovations and new ways of doing things, and some sort of like utopia, we also need some dystopia, right? I read climate fiction, near-term climate science fiction. It's horrific, but it makes you think, right? It makes you think about what is going wrong and what could go even more wrong. Oftentimes we're so optimistic with like the innovation and the goodwill will change everything that we forget to have like maybe a more level-headed perspective. And this is where I go back to accounting. Finding a way to measure and report on the wellness of people, on the resources of the planet, on the carbon emitted or avoided emissions. It's super important because if the accounting is done right, 1, 2 is credible, so you're not greenwashing. Someone else could go back and look at your numbers and your methodology and arrive to the same conclusion. Then you've unlocked something, and then you can create new business models. And this is where in open source, really often things starts as hobbies or as people are tinkering with something. And because it's not seen as a menace, as something that could disrupt the others, it creates other kinds of models where the value is not on the first thing, right? So WordPress, a good example of that. WordPress did not make money by selling their software. It was GPL software. They started making money by operating servers on which their code was running for really large sites that wanted to have the right knowledge and everything you need to operate. So it was not the software, it was everything that you need to run the business. And this idea of I think it was in Japan where they were asking the auto manufacturer, if they were great at making cars. And they said, no, we're great at making systems that build cars. And that's where we have to be thinking. Like, how would we develop systems that create hundreds of great social enterprise, collective enterprise? What would be the incentives? And also, what could we put in place that are disincentive? Like, they're called laws or regulations. So we also have to hack politics. Like we can't say government is not important. It is. And Béatrice reminded us it's our money. It's ours. It's our elects.
So going back to government, and a couple of things that Béatrice said. So I truly trust the people at the bottom more than I trust people at the top. And I'm an absolute anarchist. I have this belief that on a global basis, governments are created by people that are at the top of the financial pyramid for their benefit. So I believe that we should ignore governments and not try to work within their structures, but find ways to be successful using loopholes and avoiding their structures.
Mm. Because you don't see government
from the bottom, right? I have a favorite saying that says, I would rather fail trying to change a failed system than to succeed working in one. So the thing I believe we need to do is say, look, we are part of what wrote those rules. And if we want to change it, we can't go within the structure that we created to change it. We need to find a way to create infrastructure systems like the internet. The internet changed everything. And I say, well, guys, we can create those basic market research tools, product design tools, and supply chain tools, and create the tools. So in my business, I watched IBM try to build a system that was the same and just did language translation to make every retailer in the world be the same. I said, they don't like that. So when I built the system, I said, here's the source code, make it what you want to make it. And IBM got out of the retail business. So me and 4 guys basically drove IBM out of the cash register business. because we went against all of the rules. So I will continue till the day I die to avoid rules. I will create my own rules.
I feel the need to add to this. So I think what's fantastic, I think the point of there are certain industries or technology that are massively disruptive, is and that no one can predict or contain, and that change our way of thinking of things is fundamental. I also think I agree with you that what is deeply innovative is not going to be recognized, enshrined, and promoted by some kind of policy. But my point is that I think for new technology, to ensure that new technologies lift all boats, we need to have certain systems in place. And sometimes that can be through community initiatives. Sometimes that can be through institutional support. So in the case of the example I was setting, I think it's the University of Iberoamericana in Puebla that put resources to reach out to other people. Sometimes it can be government, sometimes it can be whatever. My point about government is to say, beyond the disruptors or innovators, my hope is that we're changing a system, is that we're having a systemic change. And as long as the system, the rules of the system encourage a predatory capitalist system that's very conservative, then I think we're hitting up against something that is limiting. And so we need to not depend on government and think that they're going to solve things, but we need to engage, push them with this and say, look at what this is doing. You need to be reacting with this and supporting this to the same extent that you're supporting the same old business models in the same old way. So it's more a notion of dialogue. But I also recognize that I'm saying that from Quebec, where we've had a pretty good experience of dialogue with government, and that not all countries have that. And I also, since I'm speaking, I think the main point I think that we can all agree on is the notion of it's not one size fits all, that the community, the actors on the ground are the ones who will know best in terms of how to adapt technology in its creation, how to use it in the most important way, and that adaptation is a guarantee of a better resiliency. Certainly that's what we've seen with social economy enterprises, in COVID, where the public health system has a really hard time moving this big boat around to change practices. Organizations that are servicing vulnerable population, but that are managed by that population, are very much faster to adapt. So I think that's a key to that, but my hope is that these disruptive practices ultimately disrupt a system and not just a niche or operate for those who are wise enough or have access to it to take part in it.
Okay, let me, from the left field, take you somewhere else. This morning, we were talking about biodiversity. And one of the things that surprised me in the conversation, one of our biologists in the work he was doing was, he was saying that in working with communities in Montreal, different ethnic communities in different neighborhoods, he realized that everybody, depending on his culture and ethnic background, could have a different relationship to nature, to ecosystems, and understanding of biodiversity. In the Fab City, because of what we're proposing, it's a fantastic shift that's going to happen where we're probably going to go, because going to more distributed systems, we're probably going to go to smaller factories, more diverse, more éclaté in French, we would say, system. So we're coming from a system with very big factories where we want to maximize competitive advantages by having everything made with labor is as cheap as possible, for example, the system where we're going to be localizing. And so is that principle of diversity, because you brought up, Béatrice, the idea of it's not monolithical and you can't apply the same solutions everywhere. And so are we entering a phase in our economy where we're going to see something where we need that diversity, that flexibility, these new models, localized models to answer these challenges? I can see my question is not clear.
Well,
I would just say making information ideas and means of production, like more resources, whether that's ideas, technology, whatever, funds, more broadly available, accessible in new ways, is a way to enable production, local production. If everyone, think of those sort of old Soviet things where all the roads went to Moscow and you couldn't get between, and you had to go to Moscow and then go anywhere else. That's a huge impediment to any kind of development. And it's the closest you are to Moscow, the more you'll develop. So, giving the means and the information is certainly a good starting point.
Right. That's I'll complement that with the idea that the reason why centralized systems and closed system work better, it's because you avoid a lot of the complexity. Decentralized system and groups and a bunch of smaller groups require more coordination, more communication. So we have to invest there because that's the key. Like Horace was talking about finance and technology as the two key enablers, I think, and he mentioned education, but I would say knowledge or education or communication as a third pillar. Like we absolutely have to invest as much, if not more, in that for these systems to be put in place. And that's on the human side. That's the human factor in technology. Computers don't create bugs, humans create bugs, but if you remove humans and you just let computer program, they can play chess and they can play Go and they'll be able to drive cars, but computers will never be as creative as humans because we're imperfect, and it comes from the imperfection. So how do we develop systems in society that supports and benefit from all of our imperfections, right? We don't want something where everything is flat and everyone is the same. But it's easier to do it like that, right? So we have to recognize that there's a higher cost to being more distributed, more diverse. But if that's what we want, we will bear that cost, and we'll see it as an investment and not as spending, but as investing instead.
Horace.
Some of the things when we talk about replication, how we replicate. So I haven't had any success with universities here in the United States because they're all funded by global corporations. That's where they get the money. So they don't even, I've talked to them and they agree with it. But in Cambodia, in the Philippines, in Zimbabwe, in Kenya. So and already in the Philippines and in Cambodia, they've changed their educational process to one that focuses on open systems manufacturing, and they're going into their business schools and doing what I said. They're doing their analysis of what does our country need that we can possibly make. So they're already changing their educational systems, and I continue to have conversations with others. So now all of a sudden you have a process where their business school is going to do the market research and analysis and say, within a 200-mile radius of the campus, where's the money going? And okay, once they identify that, then what can be produced locally? And if it's agriculture, then, and so the other piece that each of those are working with, so I've given them all the designs on the tractor, but I say, you understand, you need refrigerators, and the only thing on a refrigerator that the vendor makes is the label he puts on the door. It's his logo. So you can design, your engineering school can design an open system, scalable refrigeration architecture that goes from a little small refrigerator to commercial, and you can start making those in your country. I said, here in the United States, electric bicycles are the rage. They cost about $3,000. Why? Because they raise venture capital money to go build them. Your engineering school could design a 2 and 3 wheel transportation architecture, and you could start building food carts that are pedaled, and you could build all that locally at a much reduced price and create jobs. So that's the thing I say about it, this way of things. So I trust the people. If we can get into the universities and have them start teaching open systems concepts. Now, so I developed a little basic supply chain system that says, if you're a local merchant, you got something for sale, put it on this system. Looks just like Amazon. People can buy it and we'll deliver it the same day locally.
That's your native
Yes.
system?
So Cambodia has a pilot going with that. Philippines has a pilot going with that. I'm working on a pilot in Zimbabwe. And so so again, it goes back to, we got to do market research, product design. All of those universities that have taken my tractor, they've agreed to share everything they come up with.
And yeah, it makes me think that oftentimes, like when you design open system, there's a displacement, a second order of value that's created. So if you have free bikes, the business is not about selling the bikes. It's about what you can do once you have a bike that is cheap and electric and whatever, right? So I think this is really important in terms of framing the thought process, is that what if the shift was that the initial thing that you were selling, and that was the business model, was selling that thing, you shift it to the next level, and it's about what can you create on top of that thing. And if it's better for everyone, let's have this thing free for everyone, because we'll create more and it will benefit people more if we think like that. But it's not so obvious, because you have to be able to peek a little bit in the future, and you have to try a ton of different things to see, well, this works, this doesn't work, this scale, this doesn't scale. But this idea of like the second and even the third order of value that's created on top of open systems, that's been my observation, that is often there where more is created. So I think the pyramid, the inverse triangle, it can keep going up, right? We can add layers to it, but there's some layers where it's still pretty close. There was some question in the chat about open source hardware. And a lot of these open source hardware companies, you have to pay for the material. Like, you have to pay for the stuff. You can't avoid this cost. So oftentimes the business model is shifted to something else. You pay for service, you pay for, this is how Red Hat, the classic free software company, you paid for service and maintenance. You didn't pay for the software at first. You paid for guaranteed updates and service. They shifted. In fact, it's funny because IBM used to be all about selling hardware. They were not selling software in the beginning, because software was a way to sell hardware, and they were making more money on hardware. But as the stack evolved, and as technology stack got more complex and you had more layers, I think there's a lot of innovation at many of the layers. We could go back. It's not because some of the things have been done in the past that there's not much better things that we could come up with now, but you just have to really understand it from a systems perspective, which it takes some investment in terms of your time and thought process.
I think we all agree that business success is dependent upon producing something that somebody will pay for. And so that's where I say, that's the piece that the people at the low end of the economy is missing, understanding what they can produce that people locally will buy. I mean, local farmers have that problem. They grow too much or too little, or the diets change and they don't keep up with it. So again, that's the piece where I'm working very hard to change our university system. I mean, I believe on a global basis, by and large, our universities are making the economic divide worse instead of better, because they don't focus on, and I've had that conversation with 15 or 20 different deans and presidents of universities on a global level. And when I say it, they're insulted, but at the end of the conversation, they say, yeah, you're right. So that's one of the major pieces that I continue to focus on, and I'm making a little bit of success chipping away. But if we don't provide that basic infrastructure to the people in the local economy, they'll never rise above. And if they don't rise above where they are, if they're worried about getting their next meal, we'll never have good governance.
Mm-hmm. On those words, Horace, so we only have 3 minutes left to our session. And I really would have liked us to be in person so we could go for poutine and beer afterwards and continue the conversation. That'll be for a future summit when we can meet in person.
You know, as a farmer once said to me when I asked him when could I call him, he said, the days have no names and the hours are 24. So catch me when you can. I'll always try to be available. And I'd love to carry on this conversation with each and every one of you at some future day. I mean, you know, I come at it from a very different perspective than each of you. And I tell everybody, combat taught me more than, I mean, it made me think the way I think. And that's a hard way to learn a lesson.
Well, we were lucky to have you with us in Montreal this morning. As you know, press the red button to join the Fab City network, the Fab City movement. And we all agreed that the most important infrastructure in any city, in any community, and in the Fab City in particular, is the human layer is the first one. And so this is what we're starting to lay here in Montreal today with you guys. I'd like, because we're in Montreal, to let Béatrice do the closing remarks, please.
Hey, after I first of all, it's such a pleasure. I'm seeing people who are happy for this session. I always feel like it's such a privilege to be around, have these conversations with people who are doing really complex and impressive things. I do think that this potential even to have these conversations from a distance is what is enabling, is what is promising for the future, that we can think about these complex, huge challenges collectively and put the best brains to work for that. I would talk about, I think sometimes we think about developing new things and new business models and new stuff. I think we didn't talk a lot today about the whole world of repairing, which seems to me a huge underutilized field of work. How can we make better use of the stuff we have? How can we refurbish, reuse, enable more people to just print the button on their washing machine so they don't have to buy a new one? Has a social impact, an environmental impact. But also, if we're giving people tools to tool around with that washing machine, who knows what else they can do from it. So I think there's a whole area that we haven't explored. But the potential of having this information available so that when we're not all online, I can read up on stuff, and then to have these conversations so that I can ask people that are much smarter and more informed than me, like, what did you mean by, how did you do that? What is the impact? How did you adapt it? Why did you adapt it? I think is really a way for the future.
Yeah, and we're going to need this to build a Fab City in Montreal. Thank you, Zoom. Thank you, everybody, for your presence and for your generosity in this conversation. Sorry we were so disorganized, but I think it was a great conversation. I'm really happy. Thank you so much.
I thank you for the opportunity.